Well, Lou, where did you find my bar mitzvah picture? On behalf of my entire family, I want to thank the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, the Washington and Chesapeake chapters for the tribute you paid to me tonight. I'll try to keep as brief as I can. The last talk I gave, I received a note from a young lady who said, "Dear Mr. Davis, my doctor gave me 1 hour to live. I would like to spend that hour in one of your lectures, because 1 hour with you is like an eternity." Well, I'll try very hard that I don't put you through that tonight. I did write something, and I would like to read part of it to you and then proceed with some personal observations. If it were not for Jim Snyder, my best friend and boss, I probably would not be standing here tonight. As many of you know, Jim was a legend in Washington television news. Eventually, he became vice president of Post-Newsweek stations. And as many of you know, Jim was Catherine Snyder's father and Lou Charliff's father-in-law. It was Jim Snyder who assigned me to cover President John Kennedy's trip to Dallas, a huge political story in advance of the 1964 presidential elections. Kennedy was supposed to have been in trouble in Texas, so they decided to go to Texas to shore up their forces. Jim decided he would be the anchor in Washington and I'd be on the road. Of course, he had no idea of the magnitude the story would bring. I'd be on the road and I would be watching what was happening, and we never believed there would be an assassination attempt. I think the coverage in those initial days in Dallas was very good, considering. Responsibility was very paramount at the time. The conspiracy garbage took place in the days that followed that assassination, and some of it continues until today even. With today's news the way it is, the internet, which is largely an unweeded garden, fake news, ideological news, I don't have high hopes that if something of that magnitude, a tragedy of that magnitude, if it were to occur today, that the press would get the high marks it did in 1963. Overall, the Dallas Press Corps behaved responsibly. There was a killing of Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin, but that was done at the police headquarters because there was a mob of journalists in there, and they were out of control, and the assassin who killed Lee Harvey Oswald got in without the police knowing he had a gun. There was one serious error in the coverage of the assassination during the first minutes, and that was a report that President Johnson, or Vice President Johnson at the time, had been shot, and that was quickly corrected. There were thousands in the crowds welcoming Jackie and the president into Dallas. They were warm, enthusiastic. There was no sign of problems coming to any of them as we approached downtown. It's interesting that out of all of the people who gathered in Dallas, probably 100,000 welcomers, that only one videotape, one piece of film, was good enough to become what we call now the Zapruder film, which is the best piece of film that was taken of the assassination. Most of the other stuff shot on 16 millimeter or 8 millimeter video did not work out. Now think of what would happen today. If you had 100,000 people, I would say that fully 60 or 70,000 of them probably would have cell phones, and so you'd have 10 or 20,000 pictures of the assassination without any difficulty. There were many heroes that day, and I'd like to get that in a minute, but I want to tell you precisely what happened in the minutes after President Kennedy was shot. I was on press bus number 1 and was able to hear the 3 shots clearly. Bob Pierpoint of CBS News was sitting next to me. He had been a correspondent in Korea, and he jumped out of his seat and said, "That's gunfire." We weren't sure whether it was the police motorcycles that were going alongside of us or whether it was gunfire. Bob said, "No, it's gunfire." So we all started to yell at the bus driver to get us to wherever they took the president. Of course, he didn't know. We could see the presidential limousine dart out of the motorcade. We were about 8 car lengths behind the president's limousine. I was able to get to the site of the speech the president was going to make because we didn't know where else we could go. And he wasn't there, so I flagged down a car outside. It was a wonderful gentleman in a white Cadillac who offered me a ride. He asked me if I was a reporter, and I said yes, and he took me to Parkland Hospital. It was chaos at the hospital. I was thrown out of the emergency room. I went up to the second floor, and I called Jim Snyder in Washington. I had no contact with him from the bus, and he said the bulletin had already moved on the wire that the president was in the hospital, but we didn't know his condition. So I gave my company, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, my first report with Jim being the anchorman in Washington. And while I was talking to Jim, one of my friends, Hugh Sidey of Time magazine, was about 10 feet from me talking to a priest. And he waved me over, so I asked Jim to let me go. I'd be back in a minute or so. I went over, and just as I got to the scene where the priest was talking, I heard him say, "He's dead all right. I just gave the president the last rites." He also said that he told Mrs. Kennedy that he thought the president's soul had not yet left his body. Now, if you're Catholic, you can understand the meaning of that. I went back to the telephone, and for you young journalists in the room, this is a moment of truth. Do you go with the story? I'm sure a priest knows what a dead body looks like. I said to Jim, "Would you please take me off the air? I need to talk to you." He said, "Okay." He didn't question me, so he took me off the air, and privately on the phone I said, "Jim, there's a priest here who says the president's dead. What do you want to do?" Jim said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "It's the president, Jim. I think we ought to wait." And we did. Now, I have to tell you that those few minutes between the official announcement and the time that I said, "Let's wait," seemed like an eternity, but they weren't really. It was shortly after that the White House made the official announcement. Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff could barely get the words out of his mouth. He opened his mouth at first and nothing came out. And then he said, "President John F. Kennedy died today at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. He died of a gunshot wound to the brain." At that point, all hell broke loose. I went back to the phone, filed my story, and as I was filing my story, a White House official grabbed me by the back of my neck and pulled me away from the microphone. He said, "Come with me," and I said, "I'm not in the air. I'm not going anywhere." And he said, "No, you come with me. Right now, I can't wait." He took me downstairs. I said goodbye to Jim on the phone. I said, "I'll talk to you later." I went downstairs to the emergency room. I was put into an unmarked police car with Chuck Roberts of Newsweek magazine and Merriman Smith of United Press International. He was the dean of our White House correspondence. And we raced out to Love Field to catch Air Force One before it left for Washington. We got there in time, and President Johnson had been waiting for us. It was President Johnson who felt that the press ought to be present for the swearing in. There was some discussion between President Johnson and the president's brother, Bobby Kennedy, who was in Washington, over whether the oath ought to be given in Dallas or to wait until they got to Washington. The decision was made to take the oath in Dallas, which was the wisest decision, I thought, because if they'd have come to Washington, then every member of Congress would have wanted to attend the ceremony. You know, it'd been a terrible scene here. So the oath was delivered there. I clocked the oath at 28 seconds. We were the only three people on board the airplane who were the press. There was no one else there. The Kennedy staff, all these wonderful young people who had made the long march to the presidency with him and endured the campaign of 1960, were in tears. Young women, the mascara was streaked across their faces as they sobbed as Lyndon Johnson took the oath. I clocked the oath at 28 seconds. At the end of the oath, I was told with Chuck Roberts that there were only 2 seats left on the airplane to go back to Washington, that Merriman Smith, the wire service guy, would have 1 seat because he was wire service, and I would have to flip Chuck for the other seat. I said, "No, I'm going to get off. I want to brief the rest of the press. You go ahead back to Washington." It was some selfishness on my part in that decision. if I went back to Washington on that plane, I would have been out of pocket for 2.5 hours. And Westinghouse Broadcasting would have had no one in Dallas. And I had the only story of the swearing in. The problem I had at this point was, if you're a pool reporter, you cannot use the story you have until you've shared it with everybody else on the trip. So I had to wait till we assembled all the other reporters before I could use the story myself. And that's the way it worked out. Just a couple of points here about President Johnson and Mrs. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy was then 34 years old. She had lost a child in August, so 3 months earlier. So she had been just coming out of the mourning period, or her grief, when this all happened. When she came into the compartment for the swearing in, I could see that this beautiful woman with this lovely two-piece suit with the specks of her blood scattered all over her, her right stocking congealed with blood from the president's head wound. Her right wrist had blood on it from where she cradled his head in her lap. And the courage that she showed in that period is remarkable. And the fact that she decided, she was sitting at the casket in the rear of the aircraft with the president's body when Johnson sent word to her that he would like her to stand for the photograph for the swearing in. And she sent word back that she would like to do it, but she needed a few minutes to compose herself, and you could see why. But the courage it took for her to leave the casket, to come up forward in the airplane and be there for the oath-taking was remarkable. I think it was a wise, intelligent, and a decision that she knew she was making for a lot of reasons. Number one was the public opinion. If Jackie had not been in that photograph, it's unbelievable what the rumors would say about why she wasn't there. And so she took care that that didn't happen. Lyndon Johnson's behavior during that whole period, his compassion for her was another thing that stood out to me. When she had entered the compartment where the oath was delivered, he went over to her and took her by both hands and walked her across this 10-square-foot compartment of Air Force One and placed her on his left. He placed Mrs. Johnson on his right. And he told the judge to proceed with the oath, which, as I said, took 28 seconds. And his next words were, "Let's get airborne." I think that the strength of Lyndon Johnson, his take-charge attitude, was so miraculous that he had his wits about him. And in those few minutes after the swearing in, before they lifted off with Air Force One, he was talking to members of Congress, planning his next meetings with the Congress when he got back to Washington. In other words, the LBJ administration began within minutes of the oath-taking in Dallas, which told you something about the leadership qualities of President Johnson. A comment here about the press. I think the press corps behaved just beautifully all the time. We had to wait for Air Force One to leave. As I watched Air Force One take off with the casket of the fallen president and the new president, I thought, what a terrific country we have, that the Constitution remains that strong and the Republic was still safe. From there, I went downtown to the press club to wait for the press plane to leave, which would have been about 10 o'clock that night. And Dallas had shut down all booze. There was no liquor being served at the press club. Bob Donovan, one of the great reporters that was along on the trip, called a waiter over, a black gentleman with a beautiful bass voice. And he said, "Can't you get us a bottle? I'll give you $50 if you can get us a bottle. We just need it desperately." And the waiter said, "No, the bars are closed." And Bob kind of insisted. And Bob said, "Well, can't you just break the law just once?" And the gentleman said in his great voice he had, "I think enough laws have been broken in Dallas today." And I came back to Washington about midnight, and then the body arrived at the White House at about 4 a.m., and that's when I delivered the report and I did something that was unwise in broadcasting. There's an old rule that says, if you're not sure, don't do it, don't say it, don't play it. And I recalled the words of Robert Frost from this poem, Walking by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Kennedy used to recite that during the campaign when he ran for president. And I decided to quote those lines standing there at the White House, and I broke down at the end of it. And I was amazed at how many letters I got from people around the country that were up at 4 a.m. who heard it. And that's pretty much the story of the assassination. I just want to say something to the young journalists here in the room. The press is going through a pretty hard time right now. But I want to assure you something. The First Amendment's going to endure no matter what people do. I want to thank you very much for your attention. And again, thank you very much for the tribute.